Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining. Please confirm that you can hear me in the chat box, and we'll get started. All right. Well, again, thank you for joining. My name is Tara Vierchelis, and I'm an Urban Development Associate with the W.I. Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. This webinar series on sustainable and integrated urban development presents different sectoral topics and technical solutions that contribute to create more sustainable and low carbon cities. The webinars have a practical implementation angle by describing the actors involved, regulations needed, and financial aspects of the various solutions under discussion. This webinar series is made possible through generous funding from the Global Environment Facility. WRI, C40, and ICLEI together make up the resource team and are working in partnership with the World Bank in support of their Global Platform for Sustainable Cities, or GPSC. And the GPSC brings together participating cities and a wide range of entities that are working on urban sustainability issues to create a shared platform for global knowledge and an evidence-based, integrated approach to realize very worthwhile outcomes. And this series is part of the GPSC. So we all know that electric buses have local environmental benefits, which have incentivized cities to transition their fleets from diesel to electric. However, the adoption of electric buses globally is geographically uneven and limited in scale. One issue is the high upfront costs of electric buses. In this webinar, we will explore real-world experiences and a framework used for analysis, which includes identifying technical components that require investment, non-reimbursable funds and investment capital applied, and legal arrangements supporting the implementation. The presentation is structured around these themes. What is electromobility? Why is its implementation important in public transport? And what are the components of the electric bus business model? And we'll also have a more in-depth case study of Bogota. We are very pleased to have Sebastian Castellanos as our presenter today. He's an Urban Efficiency and Climate Associate with the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, and he leads the Vehicle Efficiency Solution area, where he provides advice and support to cities in designing and implementing low-carbon, high-efficient transport solutions and policies, including electrification of the transport sector, fuel economy policies, and intelligent transport systems, among others. Thank you so much for joining us, Sebastian. So the format of the webinar is Sebastian will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, we will have time for a question and answer period. So please, as questions arise, feel free to type them into the questions section of the chat box, and we can get to them at the end. And so with that, we're ready to start the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Hope you can hear me well. So please do also just check back on us on the chat feature to make sure that you can hear me well. So as Tara was mentioning, today we'll be talking about electric bus adoption, and in particular, what have some cities around the world been doing to achieve electric bus implementation in their cities. So let me just start by quickly doing an introduction about why this topic is important right now. There is currently a lot of vehicles outside on the streets right now. And of course, I'm not the one to tell you this, but you can probably see it yourselves right now in cities in Latin America and all over the world. There's a lot of vehicles outside. So what we know up to now is that there's more or less 1.7 billion vehicles roaming our streets as we speak. What is really worrying about this is that this is bound to increase almost to duplicate to 3.87 billion vehicles by 2050. So again, if you just pictured, or if you just saw out your window and you saw a ton of vehicles, just picture what twice as many vehicles will do to our streets and to our cities in less than 30 years. What is really worrying about this trend is that most of the growth that will happen in vehicle adoption will happen in developing countries. So you can see this graph here where most of the growth will be happening in China, in Asia, in Latin America. So, you know, there's still time for us to learn from what others have done. and try to divert this curve to something a bit more sustainable. However, there's very good opportunities that are happening right now. So mobility is changing, and it's changing very, very fast. So obviously, you probably have all seen in the news, these things are happening very fast. Autonomous vehicles are coming, so drivers will no longer be needed. So that's a very big disruption that's coming our way in cities very, very fast. Uh, People will no longer need to own cars. So the sharing component of these disruptions is also coming very, very fast. And finally, what brings us to our topic today is vehicles will no longer pollute. So that's also a very big disruption that's coming our way, and that's already a reality in some cities around the world. However, these disruptions will really be able to lead our cities into thriving and sustainable or not. It really depends on how we manage these transitions and how we manage the changes that are coming our way. So that's where really we come in at WRI, the World Resources Institute. We're a global research organization. We focus on environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being. We have offices all over the world, as you can see there. We have offices, our main office here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based. But we have offices in Mexico and Brazil, in India, in China, in Indonesia, in Ethiopia, and in Europe. So we're a global network of experts that work around 6 global challenges: climate, energy, food, forest, water, and cities. Um, and specifically us in the Ross Center, where we work in cities, we have over 250 staff in our country offices, and we have active presence in 55 cities around the world. So that's a bit about ourselves. So let me go back into the topic that we were talking about, uh, specifically for the transport sector. So the transport sector generates, as of today, more or less a quarter of the CO2 emissions of the energy sector worldwide. So that's a very big chunk of the CO2 emissions that are being generated as of today. So it really makes sense for us to start focusing or to continue focusing on decarbonizing the transport sector. On the left, you can see a graph from the IEA, and that's one of the scenarios that they're putting out to show that we really need to decarbonize the sector if we are to achieve a less than 2 degrees Celsius scenario where climate change won't be catastrophic. So the graph on the left, as I was mentioning, shows you two things. If we are to maintain the temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to completely decarbonize the sector by 2060. If we are to maintain a 2 degrees Celsius, we can decarbonize by 2100. What I'm trying to tell you here is that there's really not much time. 2060 is really around the corner. And if we are to do that, we really need to start planning from today. What are the policies and what are the policies that we need to implement in our cities in order to make that happen? This presentation, I will focus a lot on buses, and that's really the main focus of our research, and I'll tell you a bit more about the research in a minute, but we will focus on buses. Why will we focus on buses? Because buses are the predominant mode of transportation for a lot of the population around the world, in particular in developing countries, and buses are even though they're a small part of urban fleet. So I have an example here of Bogota. In 2006, the bus fleet in Bogota was less than 5% of the total vehicle fleet in the city. However, it was producing 23% of CO2 emissions, 55% of particulate matter, and 40% of NOx. So the bus fleets in a lot of the cities around the world where at least we work in developing countries are disproportionately responsible for a lot of the externalities that are coming from the sector. However, since they are small fleets and they are normally under the control of city governments, then it really makes sense to start focusing on those fleets. So we have this topic that brings us today to this webinar, which is electrification. So we see electrification as that hope of decarbonizing the transport sector. And again, we'll start by bus fleets. So currently, the penetration of electric vehicles is very, very small. If you remember the number I gave you before, there's currently 1.7 billion vehicles around the world, and of those 1.7 billion, there's only, as of today, more or less 4 million electric vehicles in our roads today. So that's very, very little. It's really minuscule. However, obviously there's a lot of work in this topic, and many different organizations have been looking at what this market will look like in the future. So Bloomberg New BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or one of these organizations are working on the projections, and what they project is that by 2040, more or less 35% of the fleet will be electric, and a big part of the sales will also be electric. So that's that's encouraging signs that things are moving in the right direction. On the other hand, and probably a lot of you have been hearing these type of information, this type of information on the news, but battery prices are falling very, very fast. So you can see what had been happening for the past few years with battery prices. They from 2010 to 2014 they fell 40%, 2014 to 2017 30%, and the projections is that the battery prices will continue falling. There's obviously a limit to that fall in prices. However, we have seen some projections that really tells us that in terms of capital cost, a full electric vehicle, including the battery, can become cost competitive with a regular diesel or fossil fuel power vehicle. So the jury's still out on that, on when that will happen. And again, there's a lot of different projections, but somewhere in the 2020s that will happen. Some other encouraging signs that we have seen is that the market is obviously preparing for this big transition. Again, probably you have seen the news in the past year or so, a lot of companies doing announcements that they will be moving away from fossil fueled vehicles. So Volvo, for example, all Volvo cars to be electric or hybrid by 2019. So that's a very, very big announcement. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around Tesla and how their big factories might be able to also reduce the cost of batteries. So again, moving the market ahead. But what is really interesting about all these things that are happening is that the public sector is also moving towards the same goal. So again, you have seen countries like Britain, France, India, all making announcements. And obviously these are big automobile markets. So it's very interesting that these economies are making these announcements. So they're all saying we're going to ban petrol and diesel engines by 2040. And again, I mean, that's a very, very clear signal that countries are moving towards full decarbonization of the transport sector. Some of the other interesting things that we have seen, and this graph that you see here on the screen right now is data that we have produced here at WRI with other tools that we have, and I'll be happy to run you through these at a later point. So just feel free to email me if you're interested in these types of graphs. So what you can see here is on the left, the farthest bar to the left, it's a diesel Euro 5 bus. We're comparing that diesel Euro 5 bus in terms of CO2 emissions from electric buses in all the different countries that you see on the right. So we're comparing what happens if you ride or you're using a diesel Euro 5 bus in India versus an electric bus in India and China, and you can see that in terms of CO2 emissions, because the grid in these countries is still fairly carbon intensive, it might not make complete sense from a CO2 perspective. However, in all the other countries, Indonesia, United States, Turkey, Mexico, Chile, the Netherlands, Ethiopia, Colombia, and Brazil, that we run the numbers for, since their grids are fairly cleaner, then it already makes sense from a CO2 perspective. And I want to make emphasis here on the CO2 perspective because there are a lot of other benefits from electrifying transit fleets beyond just the CO2 emissions, but we'll get to that in a minute. So our question really is this going to be enough? Are all these announcements and all these things that are happening around the world, will those be enough in order for us to reach a less than 2 degree Celsius scenario by 2050? And we don't know. However, we did do a lot of research to try to figure out how the world is moving around this topic. So you can see here, this is a bit outdated already because we produced this graph a couple of years ago. So this map has changed quite a bit in the past 2 years. It's impressive. However, this really does give you a sense of how the cities around the world are moving in this topic. So the dots you see here are all the cities around the world that have implemented some sort of electric bus fleet, whether it's fully battery electric or fully battery electric buses, or hybrid electric buses. So we're really mixing both types of fleets here, even though there are very there are big differences between both of them. But the point in this map that I would really like to make is, if you can see what's happening, there's a lot of things happening in the US, a lot of things happening in Europe, a lot of things happening in China, but very little happening in the rest of the world. And again, I just want to make the caveat here that this map has changed quite a bit in the past 2 years. But again, this just gives you a sense of how things are moving forward. So really, this begs the question of why is adoption being done in the developed world and places like China, but very little happening in the rest of the world. So that really is our research question, or the question that we were asking ourselves when we started producing these numbers. And that's really what I'm going to talk about in this session. So we started doing research. We did a lot of interviews. We talked to a lot of people all over the world, and in particular in Latin America. And we identified 4 big barriers to adoption of electric bus fleets around the world. So the first barrier, which is really not very surprising, and I think that probably everyone here can already say this, is that these vehicles are more expensive. So it's not only the vehicle itself, but it's the battery, and on top of the battery, there's the additional infrastructure that you need to put in place. So in terms of capital expenses, these vehicles are much more expensive than a comparable diesel bus. So that's, of course, the first barrier. Second barrier that we identified talking to operators and cities was that there's a big fear of change and a lack of knowledge on how these technologies work. So people today are already accustomed to their diesel bus fleets. They know how they work. They know the guy that sells them the pieces for their engines. They know the guy that sells them the diesel. So the whole supply chain is already built around diesel, and there is a big fear of changing that to something else. So that's a second barrier we identified, and that's a hard barrier to overcome, because it's a mental barrier. So how do you actually overcome this? And we'll look into some solutions in a minute. The third barrier we identified was that even though in a lot of countries the bus routes are not very long, or in average bus routes are not very long, there's still that question about one, reliability of the buses themselves, because obviously it's still a fairly new technology, although we already have buses running for several years in China, for example. But also if what the technology gives out today is enough to cover all those routes. So we have seen some tests, and cities have run 240 kilometers on a single battery charge, but is that enough for every single route? Perhaps not. So there are definitely certain cases where the technology is not ready to completely replace a diesel fleet. So that's the third barrier. And then the fourth barrier that we identified was that the procurement models that some cities are using as of today are outdated. And well, of course they're outdated because they were thought for a different type of technology, but they are really thought for diesel vehicles, where the capital expenses are the main concern. But if you remember the first barrier, since electric buses are much more expensive from a capital expense perspective, then it's really hard for electric vehicles to compete on an even level with diesel engines when there's public procurement happening. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen there in updating those procurement models in order for an electric vehicle to really compete at the same level with a diesel engine. So those are the 4 barriers we identified. Of course, there might be more. This is the way we classified them. And this is the way we then try to figure out how to overcome them. So what we did was we did some research, and I'll explain a bit more in detail the research that we did. But we really tried to focus on that first barrier, on trying to identify and understand how cities were overcoming that first barrier. But in doing so, we actually found ways in which cities have been overcoming all of the other barriers also. So that's really what I'm going to tell you a bit about in the next 20 minutes. So just before that, I will obviously, we just have 20 minutes, so I won't be able to answer every single question, or there's a lot of information behind this. So I will just divert you. Well, first of all, feel free to send me an email if you have any specific questions. But just so you know, there's also a publication on this specific piece of research that you can access. It's available online, which is called Emerging Trends and Innovations for Electric Bus Adoption, a comparative case study of contracting and financing of 22 cities in the Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe. So you can find that's published in the Research and Transportation Economics Journal, so you can just find it online. Okay, so let me go a bit more in depth into what we did. So what we did was we looked at what different cities around the world had been doing in terms of paying for electric buses to overcome that barrier of the high capital cost. So we looked at all the cities you can see here on the map. So we looked at cities in the US, in Latin America, in Europe, in China, and in Oceania. We did a mix. We looked at a mix of technologies. So we looked, as I mentioned before, at fully battery electric buses, but we also looked at hybrid buses because since hybrid buses also have higher capital expenses, then from that perspective of overcoming that barrier of higher capital cost, it was interesting for us to look at that. Even though we understand that the output of these technologies is very, very different from the output of a fully electric vehicle. And then we also looked at fully electric vehicles that had additional capital expenses in the infrastructure. So we looked at opportunity charging buses, which is systems, which is when the buses are charged en route with additional infrastructure on the route. So we really looked at all these cities, 22 cities around the world, again, trying to understand what they had done in terms of their business models and what they had done to overcome that initial barrier of capital cost. And to frame our research, what we did was we came up with this framework that helped us compare what all these different cities had done. So our framework is what you can see here on the screen right now. It's four components, very, very easy. It's the first component we looked into in these 22 cities. What had these cities paid? Basically, so they paid for the bus, they paid for the battery, but they also paid for the infrastructure, and then there's other things that might not be a direct cost, but are, for example, intangibles, but still people are paying for them somehow. So, for example, I'll get to that in a minute, but for example, the silence of an electric engine, that's an intangible that has a value, that has a cost. So that's part of that first investment components element. The second and third elements of our framework are how did cities actually pay for those investment components. So cities can do it in two ways. They can use what we call funding sources. So funding sources are sources of money that don't require a repayment. So this typically can be a grant from local or national government. So that's something that might not require repayment. But then the other way that cities can pay for their investment components are with financial products. So these are sources of money that actually do require a repayment, and normally these are leveraging third-party capital. And finally, the fourth element and final element of our framework was what we call delivery mechanisms. And this is more what are those legal arrangements that cities were implementing in order to distribute risks and responsibilities amongst the different parties that are involved in the investments. So again, we looked at the 22 cities from this perspective, trying to understand how they had done their investments, understanding in what had they invested in, what sources of money they used to pay for those investments, and finally how legally they arranged the risks and responsibilities between the different parties. So I'm going to run you through all of these very, very quickly. But again, please feel free to download the paper or ask any questions at the end or after this session. because I won't be able to go very much in depth into all of them. So I'm just going to give you a few examples so you understand our framework and our results. So the first one, investment components. What are cities investing in? So of course, cities are investing in buses. So one of the case studies we looked into was Shenzhen in China. So Shenzhen currently has the largest bus fleet, electric bus fleet around the world, which is comprised of 14,000 electric buses. It's the first fully electric bus fleet in a city around the world. If you're interested in knowing a bit more on this, apart from the case study itself that we developed for this, which is published, we do have a couple of blog posts that you can look for in our blog, which is called thecityfix.com, where you can find a bit more information about this case. So yeah, so cities are investing in electric buses, of course. Cities are investing in charging stations. So this is a picture I took in London in the Waterloo garage, which is a garage in the middle of London, basically, that has around 60 or 70 electric buses. And one of their big investments was all the charging infrastructure. So when we were there, they were explaining to us how they had to, it wasn't only the charging station itself, which you can see there, which basically looks like a gas station, but they had to make very big investments also in the electric infrastructure that made the charging stations possible. So the substation that was inside the depot, they had to do some investments there. So there's a lot of investment in infrastructure that needs to be taken into account, because again, electricity is something that wasn't a big part of transportation before electric buses. There's depots and swapping machines. So Beijing, one of the things they did to overcome some of the other barriers was swapping, battery swapping. So instead of charging the battery on top of the bus, they would charge the battery outside the bus, and they would just swap it once the bus would get to the depot. So this is again, additional investments that need to be made if some of the other barriers want to be overcome. Additional infrastructure. So here's an example of what I was mentioning before. One of those opportunity charging stations, which is charging that happens not at the depot, but that happens en route. And we found a very interesting example of a worldwide partnership between Volvo and Siemens, where they go together and Volvo sells their buses while Siemens installs the infrastructure. So, I mean, this is perhaps this is not the best model, but it was interesting nevertheless, because of course you would perhaps want to have open standards for charging, so that you're not stuck to the same provider for the rest of the life of your buses and of your infrastructure. But nevertheless, it was an interesting scheme that we identified. Other things which are not capital expenses but are more operational expenses, training for drivers. So this is really important. Of course, these buses are very, very different. And Bogota was a really interesting case of training for drivers, where there is some sort of like incentive for drivers to move beyond a regular bus. So drivers, when they're first hired, they start driving a regular bus, and they move to a larger bus, and then they move to a hybrid bus, and now the incentive scheme is going to electric buses, so they get more responsibility, which is a very, very interesting scheme. And of course, with more responsibility comes different training and more payment. So so this is one of the things that we identified in Bogota. And what was really interesting of this case was that, as I mentioned, these are costs. So this is an operational cost that someone needs to bear. And for the Bogota case, it was actually the manufacturer that was bearing this cost. So the cost, they included in the cost of the buses the training, and then the manufacturer was the one training the drivers. So again, interesting mechanism to pay for that. And then some of the other things which I already mentioned, which are not direct costs to the project, but are anyway what we call intangible costs. So things like reputation. So that's something that does generate value and can be either paid for or can be taken advantage of to find pots of money to pay for the infrastructure. So, very typical example. This is a bus in Gothenburg that's inside a library. So, showing that these are very silent buses. They can even have a bus stop inside the library. So this slide here, it's very busy, and again, I won't go into the details of every single element here, but you can read it in our paper. But this is really what we found in the 22 case studies that we looked into. So, cities are investing in land, in charging stations, buildings, buses, in operational expenses, planning, building and installation, operation and training, maintenance, and in intangible assets, safety, resource efficiency, reputation, and affordability. So that's the first element. So let's now move on to the second element. We have 10 minutes left. So we'll move on to the second element, which is funding sources. So funding sources, just to give you a quick reminder, is how did cities pay for the first component, which is investment components, with sources that are non-refundable. So one of the first things that we identified was that electric and hybrid buses can be cheaper to operate. And there's a lot of still conflicting evidence as to if they are cheaper in their overall life cycle or not. So a paper actually just came out a couple of days ago, saying no. A paper had come out a couple of months ago saying yes. So there's still a lot of conflicting evidence, and I think that this really depends on a case-by-case basis. So again, we do have a lot of tools at AAA that can help you identify this in a bit more detail. So we'll be happy to support you in that if you're interested. But anyway, on the case studies we looked into, we saw that that was one of the big pots of money that cities were dipping into to pay for the investments, which is the cheaper operational expenses. So, for example, in Seattle, which are hybrid buses, they had a reduction of 4% in maintenance of the hybrid buses, and reduction of 27% in fuel consumption. So that's that's an important reduction in operating costs that can be used and to leverage higher investments at the start of the investment. Other things that we saw was, for example, Foothill in California. The city provided a no-cost lease to the transit agency to implement their charging infrastructure. So again, the operating agency used some grants from the city to pay for that, but it was a grant that wasn't really a transfer of money. It was simply a no-cost lease for the land. So, interesting ways of paying for things without actually taking money out of your pocket. In London paid for the first part of their electric bus fleet with a grant from the national government, which was the Clean Bus Technology Fund, which was targeting cleaner transit technologies from an air quality perspective. So London received, if I'm not mistaken, £6.5 million to pay for the difference in capital expenses for the electric buses. So that's really interesting because, again, they're using a national source of money to pay for something at the local level. But in addition, that national source of money had an air quality objective to it, which is not necessarily linked to transit. So it's really interesting to see how electric buses can target different things and not only specific to transportation. Again, I won't go into the details of all of this, but this is what we found. So funding sources, the first element, which we call proceeds. So fare box revenues, cities are using fare box revenue, of course, to pay for this. Land value capture, advertising, and operational savings. We saw a lot of subsidies, of course, which is, disencouraging, I would say, to say the least, for a lot of cities that won't have access to those incentives. But we did see that there are other ways to pay for that. So, for example, Bogota, and we'll get to the Bogota case in a minute, we saw some really interesting fiscal incentives that, again, don't require money to be transferred between parties. And then preferential pricing, also very, very interesting things happening around the world. Utility companies paying for part of the investments or providing other types of incentives, such as stability in electricity prices, which is very, very interesting. And then other budgets, transfers from other areas of the government, specific taxes, and sale of assets to pay for the new investments. In terms of financial products, we really didn't see too many things happening, but there were nevertheless interesting things that we saw. So Bogota is, a very, very iconic case where the investment for the buses comes from the private sector, which is not the case in every city. A lot of cities, particularly in North America, um, the the bus operations are completely public. So just showcasing this as an example of how the private sector can get involved in hybrid in electrification is interesting. In China, very interesting financial products being implemented. So green bonds issued by the city to pay for part of their electric bus fleet in Tianjin. Again, going back to Bogota, Bogota went to an international climate fund, the Clean Technology Fund, and they received $40 million in loans to pay for their hybrid buses. So again, other pots of money that are not either local or national, and that other cities can aspire to. Brazil, we saw BNDES, which is the National Development Bank, giving concessional financing to operators at the local level for buses that were produced in Brazil. So, this is more of an industrial policy, but again, it's having repercussions at the local level with lowering the cost of capital for transit implementation. So again, not too many things, but nevertheless, we did see interesting things happening. So obviously, private and public equity, loans, international climate finance, green bonds, and concessional loans. Finally, delivery mechanisms. So how did risks get allocated between the different stakeholders? So one of the most interesting things, and that has really led us to do a lot more work on this topic after this initial research, is the leasing models that we identified in some places around the world. So instead of owning the buses, which was typical before, a city or a private, even a private operator would own the buses and then operate them themselves. We have seen a lot of interesting things happening around third parties purchasing buses and then leasing them to operators, and that way uh, operators and cities can overcome that higher cost of capital, and then they would just pay the leasing cost, which becomes basically a fixed recurring cost. And then whoever purchases the buses can access other sources of money to overcome that big barrier. So really, that's one of the most interesting things that we have seen around the world, and obviously that leads to a lot of different arrangements in terms of both procurement, but also of distributing risks between the different parties. Also, one of the most interesting things we found was that, of course, the political will was very, very important. So, whenever some of these goals went into some sort of public policy document or public plan, then that helped in aligning a lot of this, every stakeholder in the same path. And that was one of the things that we saw that was one of the key success factors for implementing electric buses. Um, so this is the summary of everything that we found. Again, you'll have the slides at the end, so don't worry about this. You can check this in more depth, but it's what I have been talking about. So basically, I just want to put this slide here to show you that there's a lot of things happening around the world. There's not a single formula for every city, but some of these elements can be replicated and can be adapted to each of your local conditions, which is what makes this research so interesting. So, Tara, we have 2 minutes left. I think we might skip the Bogota case study, if that's okay for you, so we have time for questions.
I leave it up to you. Either way, if you can get through it in 5 minutes, then I'd say go ahead.
I don't think I can get through it in 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, I think the audience probably appreciates a longer time for questions. So thank you so much, Sebastian. That was alarming, but also promising in sort of the creativity and the political will that's making this work in certain places around the world. So thanks for that overview. So as Sebastian said, we can now open it up to the audience for questions. So let's see if we have any questions. Okay.
If there are no questions, I can definitely go ahead and do the case study.
Well, we do have one person asking for the case study, so, and we have one question. The question is, what do you suggest in terms of battery disposal?
So, of course, this is a problem that not too many cities are thinking yet about. But what we're suggesting right now is that that's not really necessarily the issue of the cities. The city might not be the best stakeholder to be thinking about that. So when you start seeing some of these models where there's leasing of the assets, so think about that. If you lease the battery, you're not, the city or the operator is not taking ownership of that asset. So it really becomes the responsibility of that lessee or whoever owns the battery to make that disposal. So obviously it is the role of the government to make sure that that happens in the correct manner. So instead of thinking in depth what is going to happen with this at the end of the life cycle, what cities should be doing is really making sure that the responsibility is well defined, so that that third party can do that in a correct manner and following all legal procedures and everything. So this is very, very different from the way things are done today, because and when ownership is transferred of those assets to a city, then it becomes entirely the city's responsibility to see what happens with those assets at the end of the life cycle. So these new business models are opening the opportunity for new ways of doing that and giving that responsibility to someone else.
Okay. Thanks. That was a great question, Armando. Very forward thinking. So the next question we have is from Carla Arellano, and she asks, have you investigated how to deal with old batteries once they have finished their lifespan? And that's the same question, but and then Till Bahor, he asks, can you provide more details about the findings on the total cost of ownership between traditional alternatives and e-buses? And what were the main drivers, and were there differences between the studies? For example, what could explain the contradicting findings?
Right. So again, I think this is really, to me right now, it's still very, very hard to come up with a universal finding on that topic. I think the local conditions are very, very, they are a big factor that plays into the different findings of the studies. But basically, the main drivers is what I mentioned during the presentation. Electric buses have higher capital cost, but lower operational cost. So we have also done some analysis, and I can speak to the analysis we have done in Brazil, for example. And the analysis we have done in Brazil clearly show that in a city like Belo Horizonte, electric buses are cheaper to operate. And when your investment horizon is 12 years for an electric bus compared to 10 years for a diesel bus. So there are so many different variables that all these studies can change, that it really makes it hard to compare between them as of today. I haven't really read the second I mentioned, because that really came out 2 days ago, so I haven't had the time to read it. But there are so many of those very specific factors that can play a role between those different studies, that it's really, really hard to say. So my suggestion is that you can't go by those studies yet. You really need to look a bit more in depth into your own specific situation. And just to tell you a bit about this, we are about to launch, and this is completely public. So everything we do at WRI is completely public and for use by anyone. A tool that can help cities in actually doing that, comparing different types of fleets, where cities can input their local conditions. And then that tool can give them a bit more information about the results in their local conditions. So what the tool does basically is providing comparisons between, for example, an electric bus with a Euro 5 bus, which is kind of like the graph I showed you at the start of the presentation. So it will help you compare both in terms of emissions, but also in terms of cost. So I'll be happy. We are launching that in the next couple of weeks. So please, if you're interested, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to share that with you, or be on the lookout for our Twitter and Facebook feeds, where you'll probably see some information on that in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, great. I have a lot of good questions. The next one is from Mariana Orloff, and she writes, in cities that have been successful transitioning to electric vehicles, where has the initiative started? Private sector or mayor's initiative, or mostly a push from national government through financing?
That's a great question. So it's really interesting because there are very few cities that you can actually say have transition. Shenzhen and some cities in China where a big part of their fleets is electric, but in most cities we're still talking about small pilots or small fleets. And London being perhaps an exception, where they already have over 70 electric buses, and Santiago in Chile also very recently. They will start implementing 108 and 70 electric buses. So still fleets are very, very small. So I think it's hard to say that a transition is already happening or has happened. However, in most of these, we have seen that it is an initiative from the public sector. And as I mentioned in my last slides, a lot of the times it's some sort of political commitment that has driven the implementation of that implementation. So either the mayor commits that they are going to implement electric buses. In the case of Paris, this 2025 bus plan was something that came out of Paris being the host of the COP in 2015. 2015. So it is a lot driven by public sector announcements and mayors making announcements and making commitments. And of the drivers that has led to some of these cities making announcements is C40's Clean Streets Declaration and Clean Bus declarations. So also that has helped a lot in moving some of the political will, which is really, really important.
Okay, the next question is from Rohan. Have you been able to study examples of a city running some sort of evaluation process to choose between swapping and charging stations?
So no, unfortunately, we haven't seen that in depth. Perhaps Medellin, so Medellin in Colombia. We just finished assistance that we gave to them, and that was one of the things we did look into, some of the different options. Some of the different options in charging infrastructure. But again, it really ends up being something at the local level, in local conditions, and even at the route level. So not every single route perhaps is suitable for every type of charging. So my suggestion here again is to go a bit more in depth, look at the situation at the local level. Again, we are happy to support you. We'd be happy to support you. We have tools that can support cities in all of this. So yeah, but we haven't looked into that specific question in depth.
Okay, and the next question is from Alejandro. According to the different realities of Latin America, what would be the best financial mechanisms to foster the public electromobility?
So I'm going to go back to this slide, which really shows you all the different options that cities have. So as I mentioned while I was talking about this slide, I don't think there's a single option that works for any city. And local conditions are very peculiar. So it might be that your city has a national grant that can support you in that, and that's great. Or perhaps your city doesn't, but you have your city can issue bonds, for example, and that's not the case in a lot of cities. Mexico City being an example. So perhaps if you can issue a bond, well, wow, that's a great mechanism to to raise funds to pay for this. It might be that your national finance minister is really, really keen on trying to access an international climate fund, and they want to push for a project that goes to the GCF, for example. So local conditions are really determinant in what is the best way to go about it. So really, the objective of this research is not to come up with a single solution, but rather to present the different solutions that cities are pursuing elsewhere, to spark some innovation at the local level, to build business models that are suitable for those local interventions. And again, that's kind of the way we work also with cities. We don't believe there's a one size fits all, but rather, we're happy to sit down with you guys and think this through, and use our experience and these types of research to help you think through about what the best way to go about it is.
Right. The next question is from Sarah. Have you seen cities improve the one-to-one charging infrastructure to bus ratio?
Not sure I understand that question. The one-to-one. No, I'm sorry. Can you clarify that question, Sarah, please?
Let's see. Okay, we'll give you a minute to clarify in the question section, and we'll go to the next one from Florian. Did you come across other examples where other reasons were mobilized to fund electric buses in a similar way London managed to get national funding for its electric buses on the air quality rationale?
So not raising funds for that, but we did see a really interesting case in the UK, in Milton Keynes. So I mean, this is also published in an academic paper. So I would really encourage you to go and look for that paper. So it's Milton Keynes in the UK, and what they found was that they implemented, I think it was 12 or 11 buses in a single route, with opportunity charging. And what they found was an increase in ridership. I think it was 5 or 6% for that route. So what becomes interesting to me is that that can in itself be a good argument to ask for additional funds for your electric bus implementation. But in addition, it really shows you that electric buses, even though they have all these benefits in terms of local and global emissions, they can also become an excuse to increase or improve service quality in the transit system. So the Milton Keynes example really shows you how the users really do appreciate these types of investments, and although you get all these good air quality and local emission and global emission benefits, you are also making this for your users. So that's perhaps not this very specific example of what you asked, but it really shows you that electric bus implementations go beyond just that, those initial two objectives that we mentioned.
Okay, we have a few more questions, and I'm impressed by how insightful these questions are. Here's a good one from Maria Alejandra. Do you have any recommendations to overcome the challenge of fear of change and lack of knowledge regarding the use of electric vehicles?
Yes. So we're doing a lot of that work right now in a couple of cities in Latin America, which has been really, really interesting. So actually, if you go back to the leasing model I mentioned, so in the leasing model, if a city or an operator doesn't own the assets, then some of those perceived risks that are, for example, oh, what will I do with the battery when it's not working anymore, or will the battery continue holding its 100% charge for the next 7 years that it needed to hold its 100% charge? So actually, all those risks are transferred to a third-party actor. So something like that, for example, really helps you in carving out risks in a better way. So that, for one, reduces risks or reduces the perception of risks from the operator side, which is what is really causing this that challenge. But then by allocating those risks to a party that can better manage them, so let's say, for example, that the company that's leasing the battery is the battery manufacturer, then of course that battery manufacturer will be in a much better position to take on that risk. And of course, them taking on that risk will potentially reduce the cost of that risk, and again reduce that anxiousness of the operator and the city on that. So these like new innovations and business models that are happening are a way of not only overcoming that risk of higher capital costs, but of better moving those risks to whomever should or is in a better position to take them on.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions. I'll just read them to you, and you can, because we have about less than a minute to go. So Carla says, we want to implement electric buses in Quito, Ecuador, but we don't have the legal tool to sell electricity for mobility. Do you have any examples of how it's done in other countries? Prasad asks, is there a case study of a city which has redesigned or retrofitted its existing bus depot terminals to accommodate electric bus infrastructure like charging stations, etc.? And Armando asks, do you have any comments on the Albuquerque scandal?
Okay. So on the first question, I'm guessing that the Quito utility is a public utility. If that's why there's no legal recourse to that. So I actually haven't come up with that specific example of how to overcome that barrier. I mean, we can look into that in a bit more depth. Sorry, can you remind me the second question?
The second question is, do you have a case study which is redesigned, a city that's redesigned and
Oh yeah,
retrofitted
right.
their existing bus depots?
Yes, so I showed you a picture of London, which is the Waterloo garage, and that is an example of how they retrofitted completely that depot for electric buses. So that depot is today 100% electric, and it didn't used to be. So that is a great example. Again, I visited that garage, and it was interesting how Richard Harrington, it's from Go Ahead. He's the guy from Go Ahead London, which is one of the operators, and they are the ones that operate that garage. He was running us through exactly, all those challenges that they had to overcome to do that retrofit. So they had to completely revamp their operations because they had to think about, okay, we need to charge these buses for, let's say, 4 hours, but then we need to have this specific bus come out first. So they had to really do a really in-depth planning process to do that revamp. And again, as I mentioned, there were a lot of investments in electric infrastructure that they had to do, but they were completely successful, and they are really happy. Go Ahead is a private operator, and they're really happy right now with the way things are going with their buses. And the final, the Albuquerque scandal. Well, I mean, I think those things happen. We actually do have some other examples of things that didn't go well. Bogota with their electric with their bendy bus was one of the examples. Bogota did do some tests with a single bendy bus, and they had a lot of problems, and they weren't problems related to the batteries or the motor. There were more problems with the manufacturing of the bus itself. And same thing happened in London, actually. So Go Ahead for initially bought the buses from a Chinese manufacturer, and again they had a lot of problems with the manufacturing of the bus itself, not with the batteries or the motor. So what they decided to do was they decided to go to Scotland to have the chassis of the bus made there, but they kept the battery and the motor, the electric motor, from the Chinese manufacturer. So I mean, I think, of course, this anyway is a new technology. Things like that are bound to happen. But I mean, there's a lot of examples already in China of long-term operations that are going quite well. So a city can decide if they want to pilot things first or not. But that's a risk that with every new technology will is bound to happen, I guess.
Okay, so I want to be conscientious of everybody's time. We do have a couple more questions from Sarah and Nicholas that we can respond to by email. And as Sebastian has kindly offered, if you have any other questions, you can email him directly. So I want to say thanks again to all of you for joining us today. If you're interested in our programming, you can find it at www.thecityfixlearn.org. And please stay tuned for our next webinar in the series. It's scheduled for January 24th, and we'll delve into the topic of nature-based solutions. As you exit the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey. Please do take a moment to complete it. We really do value your feedback, and your suggestions will help us to shape future webinars. And if you have any questions, you can email me or Valeria Hurtado directly. Our emails are right there. So on behalf of the resource team, I'd like to thank Sebastian Castellanos for quite a comprehensive presentation, Valeria Hurtado and Alicio Gasca for their wonderful support and coordination on logistics of the webinar, and to the Jeff and the World Bank for making the series possible. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.